Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Good evening. My name is Hank Stevenson. I run the Arizona Agenda, a daily reported newsletter that explains Arizona politics and governments to average citizens. I'll be the moderator for this evening's forum. The Clean Elections Commission is the sponsor of this event. As the state's voter education agency, Clean Elections is the official sponsor of Arizona debates, so voters can have the opportunity to hear directly from candidates, ask questions on the issues that matter most to them, and vote informed. Voters that are watching this debate live, you can submit a question at any time. You can do that via email, debates@kc-a.com, or you can text 408-302-1810. That's 408-302-1810. Or you can even call them in 480-937-1253. We may not get to all audience questions, but we'll do our best. Tonight, we're hearing from Republican Christopher Stapley, a candidate for the State Senate in Legislative District 9, which covers West Mesa and historic downtown, as well as a small portion of Tempe. We also extended an invitation to Stapley's challenger, Republican Senate candidate Robert Scantlebury, but he declined to attend. As this is a primary election debate, candidates are competing against each other for their party's nomination to become their party's official nominee. All registered voters, including independent voters, can vote in the primary. Independent voters, however, must choose a single party ballot that they wish to vote. All right, Mr. Stapley, why don't you tell the voters a little bit about yourself? Tonight, it's just you and I, so we'll do about 30-minute Q&A.
Thank you, Hank. Appreciate you as well as the Arizona Clean Elections for hosting this forum and allowing an opportunity for us, myself, as well as all the other candidates out there that have elected to be part of this process to be able to share why it is they're running and hopefully have greater transparency as we're trying to continue to move forward with this election season. So, as has been indicated, my name is Chris Stapley. I was born and raised in Mesa, Arizona. I'm a fourth generation Mesa, Arizonan. For those in the East Valley, particularly in Mesa, they may have heard of the street Stapley. That's my grandpa's great uncle. So we've been around in the Phoenix metropolitan area for a hot minute. I've moved away a few different times, and with each time I've moved out of the state, I keep getting called back. I love this state. This is home. We have my wife and I. We've been married for 19 years. We have 4 kids, and we've decided to raise our kids right here in Mesa. We have 3 children currently in public school. We love the public school system. We also love school choice. My wife actually teaches at a charter school. Uh, we um, we love this state. The state is beautiful. And the main reason why I felt like I should run at this time is because things have just gotten so incredibly toxic. Uh, Frankly, I'm a trial attorney. Right now, I practice mostly family law. As you can see, my diploma is in the background there. Um, and it's challenging dealing with toxic scenarios as I do professionally. But I've been able to help professionally diffuse difficult situations and help people come to solutions. That certificate right there is mediation. I'm an Arizona mediator as well. I've helped mediate difficult situations. As most people are aware, there's a poll that was done recently that showed that 62% of Arizonans prefer candidates willing to compromise and work together. I hope to be able to do that if elected as our state senator for Legislative District 9. My opponent, Mr. Scantlebury, I've consistently heard over and over again he's a nice guy, but unfortunately, I don't think he's the right fit. He ran 2 years ago and lost in a non-presidential election year by just over 5 percentage points to the current senator, flipping West Mesa into a Democrat area for the first time in modern history, for sure. I I would like to use my skills as a mediator, as a problem solver, to help come to compromises, to help our state grow. There's only 42%. A recent study showed that only 42% of Arizonans are confident that Arizona is prepared for future growth. That's dismal in my opinion. That's so low. I'm hoping that I can be a part of helping instill greater confidence that Arizona is prepared for our future growth.
Well, that seems like a good place to start. You mentioned your mediation skills. How would you employ them at the Capitol? And I guess also, like, more broadly, you know, you're hoping to join the Republican majority at the Capitol, assuming they are still in the majority after this election season. And Democrats have long complained that the Republican Party rules pretty strong-handedly, and that they don't feel like there's a whole lot of give and take from the majority party, which has the votes to pass legislation. So I guess, you know, kind of how do you use those skills in particular scenarios? How do you think that would come in handy? And then what more broadly do you think about where you should be willing to compromise? Because obviously, as a, you know, politician or political candidate, you hold strongly held beliefs. But part of the job is compromising and finding, you know, solutions, even if maybe they're not 100% what you want.
That's a very valid point. And there certainly are things that there's going to be a line in the sand. But as far as the abilities that I'll be able to bring as an individual that professionally I've developed my ability to help individuals come to compromises, what you got to do is really you look at two things. You look at first, what is the issue? And then second, how do we overcome the challenges associated with that issue? So for example, one of the very serious issues that I'd like to help address if I make it to the Capitol is inflation and affordable housing. Those are very hot button issues. I know inflation has made a huge impact on my personal finances, and I know there's many less fortunate than I am. With 4 kids, it's challenging to have those difficult conversations with my wife as we sit across the table and try to figure out how are we going to pay for everything. Our grocery bill feels like it's double, and it's not just because of my senior in high school. We've had some major challenges there. But one thing to specifically address would be there was a bill that was presented this year that dealt with affordable housing. And the Republicans and a handful of Democrats were involved in trying to discuss and come up with clever solutions how to resolve that. Ultimately, the governor decided to veto that bill. I think at the end of the day, it would have been helpful to make sure we have more of the appropriate stakeholders that are there, so we can bring all of the right appropriate people together, so that we can come to those solutions together. So that'd be one example of, okay, well, some very conservative, frankly, mayors had even come out against that bill. So that goes to show that we need to make sure we're bringing all of the right people to the table. So not just all of the Republicans, but let's get some Democratic ideas in there as well. Let's get the mayors, the key stakeholders. The mayors, for example, they're on the front line of approving the permits and such. So it makes sense to make sure that they're involved and see if there's ways at the state level that we can help. And that's just one area that we can address. There's a lot of other areas as well.
And that was I believe it was dubbed the Arizona Starter Homes Act that you're referencing, right? That would have essentially restricted cities' ability to regulate zoning to potentially increase the supply of housing, get it out there more quickly.
That's correct. Yeah, that's the bill I was referring to. Yeah.
And you mentioned line in the sand issues. What are those to you? What are the handful of issues that you do not think that there's a place to compromise from your, you know, moral beliefs or political beliefs?
I mean, for each person, of course, there's going to be a little bit of a different aspect in that. Even within our own political parties, we have different stances. For example, we have the recent abortion bill that the repeal of the Civil War era bill. There was a handful of Republicans that helped to get that repeal to go through, and the vast majority of the Republicans were not okay with that. My opinion on that issue, for example, is I am a pro-life candidate, but I think, frankly, it was a huge missed opportunity to help shape the discussion and help others understand why it is Republicans in general are pro-life, which at the end of the day is because we believe in the sanctity of life. And we've lost some ground in the discussion, in that very discussion. So that's one example. I think, frankly, before moving on from that specific issue, I think that Civil War era law was outdated and it did need to be repealed, but not just repealed, but replaced with something more appropriate. And it appears from some leaked PowerPoint slides that the Republicans are trying to grapple with how to handle that issue. But I think that needs to be a little bit more transparent in how we have those discussions with the public. And so again, I think that was a huge missed opportunity. So that's one area that I believe that is a line in the sand. At the end of the day, I don't think abortion, for example, should be used as a form of birth control. I think that's too far. And frankly, I think most people understand that as well, that there is an element of life, that sacredness to life. Another issue that is near and dear to my heart is faith. I believe at the end of the day, most people, there was a poll that came out just a little bit ago last month that indicated 49% of Arizonans and 50% nationally no longer attend an organized religion. I am active within my Christian faith, but I also at the same time respect other faiths. And sometimes I think we get a little bit too tribalistic in that way. We had the very first Mesa National Day of Prayer. The Mayor Giles had enabled that to happen, and I feel blessed to have been able to attend that. I think we need to do more to engage the interfaith groups, and I recognize there's some on the other side of the aisle that don't believe that they have much of a space in the public sector.
Well, so thank you for answering the abortion question. You saved me from having to ask. But I do want to kind of have a follow-up here. You said that you believe that Civil War era law goes too far and should be repealed, but also should be replaced with something else. So I've got two questions for you, I guess. One is, what is that something else to you? Because right now, if we repeal the territorial era ban, we still have the 15-week abortion ban that Republican lawmakers and Governor Doug Ducey signed into law a couple of years ago. So if that's not what you want to see Arizona's policy, if you could explain exactly where you would draw the line. And then two, follow-up question there. So a big part of the debate over repealing this was just whether Republicans were willing to break ranks on some of the procedural motions to get this motion to a vote on the floor. How would you have fallen during that debate? Would you have been willing to not only vote to repeal this, but vote to force it to come to a vote, which is part of the reason why it took so long to get to that repeal?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there for sure.
Take one piece at a time. I'll remind you if we didn't get to it.
Fair enough. Thank you. At the very least, I think it makes sense to allow procedural postures to go through, to allow a full vote. Let's let people at a bare minimum be able to have the discussions on the floor, whether you feel very passionate one way or the other, or somewhere in between the two. It needed to have that ability to proceed forth onto the floor. As far as the vote itself, I think that the repeal was needed, as I'd indicated, but it did need to be replaced. And so as far as the current law now, the 15-week ban, I think for me, the line in the sand is at least minimum three things. You need to have protection for the life of the mother. That was in there in the territorial law, but the other two pieces weren't, and that was a huge concern for me. And that's there needs to be exception for, which to me ties in some ways to health of the mother, but in instances of rape or incest, that absolutely needs to be an option for the woman to make that decision. And then also viability of the child itself. If the child is not going to be viable, then we need to allow an exception there. That needs to be up to the mother to make that decision at that point. As far as the current law, I think that one element of what has not been discussed and needs to be discussed is whenever we're talking about rights in general, the other half of the rights that we have is the responsibilities. You have individual responsibilities and community responsibilities. And so with that, we need to make sure that women, however the age are, if they choose to have the child, we need to make sure that we as a society not just leave them out to dry, but that we allow the women that choose to have the children and may not perhaps be able to support the child without help, that we make sure that that help is available. So at the very least, I'd like to make sure that there's an increased access to women's health care for those women who choose to have the child and not abort the child. So that's something that I think needs to still be addressed that hasn't been addressed.
Okay. All right, I want to move on unless you've got anything more you'd like to say on the abortion issue. I've got the next big thing lawmakers have to deal with is the state budget. So we're facing a serious budget crunch this year, and part of the reason that we are facing that is because last year legislative leadership gave out between $10 and $30 million apiece to any lawmaker willing to vote for the budget proposal that they had put together. And that was partially out of necessity in a divided government to come to some sort of a consensus and finally finish off a budget. But I guess my question, the first question on this is, do you think that's an appropriate way for lawmakers to craft a budget? And would you have any problem voting for a budget that was crafted with that kind of, slush fund handouts, I guess, for lack of a better word here, incentive for people to vote for it, we could call it.
Yeah, sure. I certainly wasn't behind those closed doors to understand the full nature of what went on in those discussions. So I don't know if I can fully comment on that. But what I can indicate is when I went to Arizona State University with my undergrad, my last semester, I was awarded a prestigious internship to work for the Speaker of the House's staff. And that was during the last major budget crisis. I got to sit down on some of those confidential meetings. And it was very, very interesting to have that peek behind the curtain, so to speak, which, of course, serving at the pleasure of the speaker that stayed with me and pretty much my family that knew that they weren't going to share anything. So I don't know if I can fully adequately comment on that, other than there were a lot of very clever ideas to try to tackle the challenges with the budget deficit at that time. A series of things that were discussed at that time that were public were the state had asked Arizona State University to do an investigation of how can we perhaps lower the tax rate and broaden the types of income revenues. I thought that was an interesting approach. Ultimately, the state decided not to do that. I think my understanding also with this current set of challenges that came with a surplus, we'll call it that way, last year was that the state decided, at least my understanding was the instructions or marching orders was, these are to be one-time expenditures. These aren't meant to be permanent increases to future obligations. And my internship turned into a job at the legislature. I worked 1 year in the House Government Committee, and then 1 year in the House Appropriations Committee. So I got an even closer in-depth look at that, of some of those, not just closed doors, but public meetings as well. And something that you're supposed to be able to do as a legislator is you're supposed to be able to ask the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, JLBC, for a money impact on if there is something associated with the money. And my understanding is that JLBC was not asked to do all of the analysis on each of those points. And so I suspect as time goes on, a lot more is going to come to light of what actually happened, as is the case. But what I suspect, frankly, is that there were some things that had continued strings attached to it. And so you have to be incredibly careful in those types of situations. So on its face, again, I don't know if I can fully comment because I wasn't behind those closed doors, but I suspect there is some things that'll come to light further down the road, that there may be some bashful faces, we'll put it at that point. But we are where we're at right now, and I think we need to be open to creativity. And see how we can potentially broaden the pie. Let's bring people in. Again, I know something that then Speaker Adams did is, as well as the president of the Senate at that time, they brought in a bunch of business leaders and said, I was so impressed by this. They're in the Senate chambers. I remember sitting and taking notes on that one. And they had the business leaders sitting where the senators normally would sit. It was on the Senate side. And they said, what can we do? We want to be open and how we can help grow business, because that absolutely has to be part of the answer as well, is growing our economy. Again, going back to the recent poll that came out, only 42% of Arizonans really feeling comfortable and confident that Arizona is prepared for future growth. So that absolutely needs to be part of the discussion as well. I think we, at the bare minimum, that looks good optics, but functionally, it did end up opening up some discussions and some deregulation that was appropriate, not reckless. That did end up becoming a result of some of that.
I didn't realize we had a former budget staffer here. Now I get to go deeper.
Uh-oh.
So you mentioned all the clever ideas that Adams and company came up with back in the 2010 budget crunch era. What specifically, my original question is kind of like, what specifically would you like to cut from state government, considering we're facing this crunch? But I would like to put that in the context of like, what did you learn from that era that could be applied today? Are there any similar easy savings that we can cut to make up a couple $100 million?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I had realized and was planted in my mind way back then, before I decided to run now, was that sometimes people will run on hashtags or on short phrases and whatever. And one of the short phrases then was, let's be efficient, let's be efficient, let's be efficient with our government spending. One of the things that was pushed at that time, we used to have Capitol Police, Capitol Law Enforcement to protect the Capitol buildings, and then DPS, and they rolled those two together for the sake of saving money. It actually ended up costing the state more money because the vast majority of Capitol Police were retired DPS and other law enforcement. And so this was a tiny supplemental income to keep them busy while still utilizing the skills that they had developed professionally for some time. So we got to be careful about those little hashtags of what seems like, okay, yeah, let's be government efficient, but in the long run, it can cost more money. And so that's one example. It didn't work. As far as short-term solutions, one of the things that Governor Brewer back then suggested was a short-term tax increase. At that time, there was a pretty big hole. I think the hole now is much bigger. So that's something that, again, I think everything should be on the table. That's something to be considered.
I did catch the broadening the pie that you mentioned. If we were talking about additional revenues, that's a very hard thing to get out of the legislature, considering it requires a 2/3 majority, or they can send it to the ballot and let the voters decide. But if we were discussing raising revenues, what kind of revenues would you like? What taxes would you like to increase if it came to that? What taxes would you be willing to increase is maybe the way I should phrase that sentence.
Yeah. One thing that I didn't mention is that this time around, we have a lot more in the emergency fund than we did the last time around. And so I think what we need to look at as well is what kind of a curve are we looking at? Are we looking at like a short curve, and then maybe it'd make more sense to tap more into the short term reserves that we have versus what we had back then? So that would be one thing we need to look at. But answering your question on potential revenues, I think we should go back and ask the universities. We have incredibly intelligent and competent individuals who provided last time around suggestions on a broad base. Maybe some of those suggestions would make sense now, maybe they wouldn't. The economy has changed significantly. Our population has changed significantly, but I think we need a little bit more data for me to be able to say, let's go after this. But I do know one of the things back then, the emphasis was, what are things that particularly would impact higher income individuals, as opposed to just more of a broad base, even a little bit more of everybody. And I think ultimately that's why the Republican legislature then decided, we're not going to go there because that's just going to be not fair. And I think in general that would be my approach too. I'd be a little bit concerned if we're just attacking one demographic. That's not appropriate. And instead, the legislature, with Governor Brewer's guidance, send it to the ballot for the Arizona voters to decide. Let's do, should we do this temporary tax increase for the sales tax? And there was some great research done on that. And actually the sales tax is one of the most stable forms with the lowest volatility of income revenue for our state. So that might be something to consider. But you're absolutely right with the 2/3 requirement for the legislature. I don't think the majority of Democrats or Republicans, maybe we can get a referral to the ballot, but I don't know if a full 2/3 would be possible. So with that, again, with my mediation skills, with my abilities that I've developed professionally, I'd love to get more of those stakeholders, more of those ideas together and see where there might be some overlap and then come to a reasonable solution.
Okay, well, I could nerd out on the budget all day, but we should probably keep it moving. We've got a good question from a member of the audience here. Who will Chris Stapley vote for Senate President? I always love asking people these questions. Do you have a pick in mind? We're sure Warren Peterson is again seeking the office. Would you vote for him? Anyone else?
I don't really know, honestly. I would need to talk to some folks. I obviously Senator.
They're not calling you to try to get that vote yet? You guys are
not yet. Yeah, no, not yet. I'd certainly be open to Senator Peterson, to President Peterson. You know, it would just kind of depend. I need to have some little more feedback from different folks.
Well, I've never gotten a candidate to answer that question this early on anyway. Worth a shot.
Fair enough.
We have a couple more questions from the audience, and this is one that comes up a lot. Questions on housing. And earlier you had mentioned the Arizona Starter Homes Act. It sounded to me like you were in favor of that piece of legislation.
I'm in favor of the concept of that legislation. I think they had the right idea, but not the fully right execution. We needed to get more of the stakeholders involved. I think it largely tanked because the cities were not involved in that process, and understandably so. I mean, it was designed to essentially cut them out from underneath their knees, which I can understand that almost no city is going to be okay with that. But maybe there's other creative ideas that they might have. Hey, what if we try this or we try that? So I am for that in concept, but let's get more people on board to see if we can find a better way to handle that.
Do you have any clever ideas of your own? Any policies you'd like to float to solve Arizona's affordable housing crisis, or at least put a dent in it, I guess?
Well, one of the things that we are blessed with is we have a very prosperous country as a whole. We have a federal government that provides federal funding to help assist with low-income housing. West Mesa, frankly, has had historically in the last about 50 years a higher rate of receiving those funds than anywhere else in the state. We haven't had any new approved ones in the last 8 years, but prior to that, we had a very, very high rate of receiving those. I think there's ways that we can utilize that more effectively. So it would make sense to look at that. Some of the other challenges associated with affordability and housing deals with the actual building of new houses, of course. Maybe there's a way that we can find a little bit more consistency across the different municipalities, particularly here in Maricopa County and in Pima County and our larger county districts that have a much more dense housing needs as well as ability. I think growth should pay for growth. So we have that already largely as policy, but having some sort of parity and stability between and predictability, if you will, between the different municipalities, that'll make things easier and more affordable as well as more predictable for the builders. There's some really great projects out there I know like former Senator Bob Worsley has a fantastic program that he put together. They just finished the crowdsource funding for that, of essentially taking containers, storage, those shipping containers that come across. He found a really clever way with that company to convert those into really neat, affordable housing pods. And they can even be stacked as high as 4 stories tall. And they're really beautiful. You can check out his company. So allowing an environment to allow those types of opportunities can also be a part of that puzzle. There's no one silver bullet, so to speak, to fix that issue. But there's a few ideas that I have trying to provide greater predictability and opportunity.
I was wondering where all those shipping containers from our temporary border wall wound up. Bob Worsley bought them all, huh? Figured. Okay, we're running out of time, but I do want to hit a couple of more things, if you'll bear with me. Specifically, we've got another one on housing. The voter wants to know if you supported the piece of legislation that Governor Hobbs vetoed that would have made it easier for property owners to have squatters removed from their property. Did you catch that one? Do you know how you feel about it?
Yeah, I am aware of that. That largely came from an issue that the state of California has been experiencing some serious problems with. I have actually assisted with both landlords and tenants on that issue, legally speaking. When I was in law school, I helped develop closely with one of the law professors there, providing additional educational information for tenants. And we provided some classes for individuals experiencing homelessness. In that, being on the other side of the aisle, legally speaking, I've helped landlords hold tenants accountable when they cease to make their payments and the obligations that they contracted to do. I don't. I think that Governor Hobbs is misguided, to say the least, and her basic tenet was for her veto. My understanding was because she felt like, well, this isn't really a problem ripe in Arizona. But we see a lot of spillover being in the law. We see a lot of legal spillover coming from California here, not just a lot of new individuals that moved there, including my mom. My mom moved out here from California when she was in high school. But a lot of the laws filter over into Arizona. So I think a preemptive approach to helping prevent those kinds of issues would make sense. So yeah, I would agree that there's some version of that needs to be passed.
Okay. And you mentioned that you're a public school supporter, as well as a supporter of Arizona's school choice opportunities, and that your wife is a teacher at a charter school.
Mhm.
Trying to think of a succinct way to get this all in there, but essentially, now that we've increased Arizona's ESA program to be every student in the state is now eligible, one of the big kind of legislative battles or debates is over whether we should increase regulation on these charter schools that are receiving vouchers from the state to pay for students' tuition. So should we increase the kind of regulation and oversight that private schools face, especially when we're talking about like background checks of teachers and other like teaching standards that public schools are held to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my dad was a public school teacher. He was the first one to get an education in our line of family. And I got to hear a lot of the challenges that he experienced and had. He's retired now, but in seeing kind of peeking behind the curtain from a family side on that issue. As far as the ESA, that's a very complex issue. It's a fairly relatively new program that's been expanded, everybody, as you noted. Um, my understanding is when that was expanded, it was kind of a, well, let's expand it and then see what happens and see if we need to make some adjustments. I think it's pretty clear at this point that some adjustments need to be made. And we need to bring in the appropriate stakeholders there. For example, I have some very close friends that they've tried charter schools, they've tried public schools, and it wasn't the right fit for their children. One of their child's special needs. Some of the other children they're on it are not. One of the challenges that they experienced, anecdotally, is their oldest, as a freshman, was interested in going to the public school to have some experience with the boys volleyball. And so they approached them and said, hey, we've got the ESA, so we have some funds available. What do you think is appropriate? And then they came back and said, I don't know, we'll get back to you. And they got back to him and said, well, why don't you we'll charge you the same rate that we would for a foreign exchange student if they wanted to be involved in an extracurricular like that. I said, okay, that sounds fine. And it was fair. It was somewhere around, I think, around $300 of the tax credit. That sounds about right. So then the next year they came back and said, hey, our son was interested in doing this again. And City Mesa, or the school here in Mesa, had said, well, the school board now says we have to charge thousands of dollars for you to be a part of that. So I think there's challenges on both sides where we need to have some accountability. I have a sister-in-law that lives in Sierra Vista, and there's a lot of students on the ESA program down there. And the majority of those students, my sister-in-law works for a charter school as well, and they have some ESA students. The challenge that they found there is the majority of the students that may have some classes that would make sense for them to be a part of to round out these children's education. They don't have funds available because they're using pretty much all of the ESA to go for gymnastics or judo or something like that. I don't think that's what was really intended at the end of the day for the ESA tax credit. So I think there's room to make some adjustments there that has not been addressed yet.
Okay. I got one more for you. This is we still have to ask this every election season. Past elections. The 2020 election, 2022 election, obviously lots of members of your party do not think that those were carried out free and fair. What do you think?
When I worked for the House Government Committee, one of the opportunities that I was given was to be an election official, to undergo the election official training that the Secretary of State, which then was Secretary of State Bennett, that all of the counties and all of the cities are required to go through. And so I underwent that training voluntarily because I was House Government Committee. I didn't have any statutory requirement. I wasn't required to do that. I just thought, this sounds interesting. I want to learn better how this works. So I went to that training, and it was fantastic. Secretary Bennett took it over from Secretary Brewer, and he broke down that training. Instead of having one test after multiple days, you'd have a test at the end of each day to make sure you really absorbed and understood the material. And that was, I think, a much better approach. He made some good changes there. And coming out of that, the last day, the Secretary Bennett was there for portions of the training. The last day he came in and he asked us, okay, now that you've been through this mandatory training, what is it that you think can happen, or ideas you have to steal an election or influence an election appropriately? I thought, boy, how fascinating is that nowadays, right? Because nobody's really having that discussion in really a sane conversation anymore. And there were some great ideas that were put out there. Most of them, frankly, were by his IT people, ironically. And he even made that comment. He's like, this has scared me a little bit that my own IT people are saying, hey, there's some things we could do better. And he did. He made some of those adjustments. But based on the information that I've seen, to answer your question, based on what we have, I don't think the election was stolen. We had the Cyber Ninjas audit that even Secretary, now Senator Bennett, was a part of, that I think he could see the writing on the wall, politically speaking, of, oh man, this was kind of a stupid thing for us to do and a waste of taxpayers' money. And I know I'm saying that as a Republican, I probably shouldn't be saying that, but they didn't find anything. They found one deleted email that really had nothing to do with the election at all. So no, I don't believe the election was stolen. I think those that are pushing that narrative, it's destructive and undermining to our democracy, to the integrity of our system here. And then I hear over and over again on News Talk Radio, I've heard it a number of times. It's like, okay, well, where are those same individuals that say, hey, election's stolen, but they were elected? Okay, well, what about those folks? You're not hearing really much from them. So I think that goes to show of, okay, we don't really have the serious challenges that, at least here in Arizona, based on my training and experience, I don't see those same problems that may exist other places. I don't know, but for sure here, I don't feel there's any challenges on my side that I'm worried about.
All right. Well, I'd love to keep going, but we are already running a little bit past our limits. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for making the time and for participating. And to all the voters out there, you know what, Chris, I forgot. I'll give you a minute for closing statements. If you've got anything we didn't get to that you want to tell the voters, leave them with a good taste in their mouth or whatever, a good memory of you. You want to take it away for a minute?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I also want to thank Clean Elections. I'd like to thank you, Hank, for your part in this and helping allow greater transparency again for the election process. I just want to reiterate, we can be confident again, once again, that Arizona is prepared for future growth. We have some great investments nationally, some internationally here into our state. If you want a candidate that's willing to compromise, just like 62% of Arizona has indicated that they would prefer that kind of a candidate, I'm your guy. We need to have common sense discussion. Let's get back to the common sense and move forward and positive and trust with what we can. In general, I agree with, again, that there's only 40% of the current candidates statewide. This is what, again, another poll that came out, that only 40% believe that our current candidates for statewide and legislative offices in Arizona are talking about these issues that are most important to you. The top issues are education, border, which we need to make sure we're doing our part to secure the border, that we're having common sense solutions for that as well, not just slamming through some exciting headline there, but bringing in the stakeholders there. We also need to make sure that we're providing good education for our children. The children really are our future. I have 4 kids, 3 of which are in school right now. My youngest is 2 years old. We came back because we want to continue to see Arizona prosper, and that's why I decided to run. I just don't know if the current candidate can get us across the hill over that. He lost by about just over 5 percentage points this last time around, and our current senator is not the right fit for West Mesa. Neither is she the right fit for Arizona. I'm hoping that we can bring that hope, we can bring that common sense back to the discourse and utilize the skills that I've professionally developed to help bring parties together, find those areas of overlap, and then make good legislation, at least better legislation than we've had in recent memory. And with that, I'd appreciate your vote.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we've got. Thank you so much, Mr. Stapley, for your time. I know that you are very busy this time of year. And to the voters who made the time to watch, thank you all so much. The primary election is July 30th, and we encourage you to visit azcleanelections.gov ahead of voting for official, accurate voting information. Thank you all so much.